That night was eerily silent. The wind whispered through the tall grass, creating an unsettling rustling sound that echoed in the darkness. Beneath the dim moonlight stood an old abandoned house, isolated in the midst of a thin creeping fog. The withered trees sway gently, their shadows dancing on the house's worn-out walls. In the distance, an owl perched on a dead branch, staring directly at the house as if warning of something unseen. In a small old coffee shop in the nearby village, an elderly man with a face full of wrinkles sat in the corner, his raspy voice telling a story. Around him, a group of young men listened, their expressions tense. The tale was about the abandoned house on Dickus, about its last residents who vanished without a trace. Three chose about the eerie sounds that could still be heard from within. Curiosity outweighed their fear that night. They decided to go there. When they arrived, the worn-out wooden door stood before them. With a single push, it creaked open, letting out a long, piercing screech. The air inside was damp, carrying the stench of something foul. The beams of their flashlights illuminated the dusty wooden floor, revealing faint footprints that did not belong to them. They ventured further inside, eventually finding an old bookshelf that seemed slightly out of place. With trembling hands, they pushed it aside, revealing a small hidden door leading to the basement. The steep wooden staircase led them into a darker space. The walls were covered in strange red markings, and in the corner a wooden chair with tangled ropes stood, as if it had recently been used. They were not alone at the end of the corridor. A shadowy figure loomed, its glowing red eyes staring at them without expression. Their flashlight flickered before shutting off completely, plunging them into total darkness. Suddenly, Siska was lifted into the air by an invisible force. Whispers filled the room, footsteps echoed around them, but no one else was there. They stumbled upon an old book, filled with ritualistic writing and black candles that had melted into strange patterns. From the corner of the room, a decayed woman stood, her smile twisted inhumanly. Panic surged through them as they dashed toward the exit, only to find the door locked. Tony screamed as something unseen dragged him into the darkness. When the door finally swung open, only silence remained. Tony was gone. Days passed. Dika sat in his room, still haunted by the events of that night. As he gazed into the mirror, its surface suddenly fogged up, though the air in the room remained cold. Then his reflection revealed something that made his blood run cold. Tony stood behind him, his face covered in wounds. His eyes empty, his lips moved, trying to say something before the screen faded to black, and only a whisper could be heard. "Did you really think it was over?" Deka's breath quickened as he stared into the mirror, his body frozen in terror. Tony's reflection stood behind him, his lifeless eyes empty, his skin pale and bruised. The whisper echoed through the room, chilling Dika to the bone. "Did you really think it was over?" Before he could react, the image flickered and vanished, leaving only his own terrified face staring back at him. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. Desperate for reassurance, he fumbled for his phone and called Siska. The line rang for what felt like an eternity before she finally answered, her voice weak and strained. "Siska, I saw him." Dika whispered, barely able to form the words. There was silence on the other end before Siska spoke, her voice shaking. "Dika, I saw him too." That night, sleep evaded them both. Siska sat curled up on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, but the cold seeped into her bones. Every shadow in her apartment felt like it was watching her. A sudden knock at the door made her jump, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly she approached and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. She turned around only to feel an eerie chill sweep through the room. Her bathroom mirror fogged up, despite the room being freezing. Then, as if guided by an unseen hand, words appeared on the glass. "Help me." Her stomach twisted in fear. And before she could move, her phone buzzed a new message. The sender had no name. With shaking hands, she opened it. "I'm not gone." The phone slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The screen flickered then in a sudden burst of static. Tony's face appeared on the screen, his lips moving as if he were trying to speak. Siska let out a terrified scream. The next morning, Dika and Siska met at an old library. Desperate for answers, they combed through stacks of dusty newspapers, searching for anything connected to the house. After what felt like hours, Dika's hands trembled as he pointed at a faded photograph in one of the articles. The headline read, "Family vanishes without a trace. Only one son found alive." In the photo stood a family in front of the very same house they had explored, but what sent chills down their spines was the face of the youngest boy. It was Tony. The article detailed the gruesome history of the house. Decades ago, an entire family had gone missing, their bodies never recovered. Only the youngest son had survived, but he was never seen again. His name, Anton Dika. Whispered it aloud, his voice barely audible. "Anton Tony. It's him." But how was that possible? Determined to uncover the truth, they returned to the house. The moment they stepped inside, the air felt heavier, charged with an unnatural energy. Their flashlights flickered, barely illuminating the darkness. Then a whisper slithered through the air, calling their names. At the end of the hallway, a shadow shifted, watching them before they could react. The door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. They spun around, but the door had vanished as if it had never existed. Then footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, slow, deliberate, but neither of them was moving. A shudder ran through their bodies as the air around them shimmered. In an instant, they were no longer in the present. The room transformed, showing them a vision of the past, a warm, happy home filled with life. They saw the family from the newspaper sitting at the dinner table. Then, without warning, the horror began. A shadowy figure emerged, lunging at them. Screams tore through the air as blood splattered against the wooden walls. One by one, the family fell, their cries swallowed by darkness. In the corner, a young boy, Tony, stood frozen in terror, his small body trembling as he watched his family perish. Then suddenly the vision ended. The room snapped back to its current decrepit state, but the shadow remained standing before them. It loomed over them, its presence suffocating. And then it moved. Siska let out a strangled cry as cold, skeletal hands wrapped around her ankles. She was yanked into the darkness, her screams echoing before being cut off abruptly. Dika turned, paralyzed with fear as the entity loomed closer. He fell to his knees, his mind screaming at him to run. But his body refused to move. The shadow whispered, its voice unnatural, echoing through his skull. The truth hit him like a blade. Tony had never been human. He was part of the curse, a remnant of the horror that had consumed the house years ago. The shadow lunged. Dika's scream filled the air before everything went black.